What's up, everybody? I'm John Middlekauff. You know what I need you to do. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got content for days reacting to every NFL game all the time, every single day. Subscribe, like the videos. Let's go. Okay, it's finally here. It crossed my mind within the last couple days that typically the semifinals would have already been played and we would be coming down the home stretch of playing the national championship on a Monday, which has been thrown for a loop a little bit because the NFL has expanded their playoffs and now they have uh, they have a Monday night football game on Wild Card weekend. So I'm still trying to get used to the ebb and flow of everything, but I had to get my guy Jackson on the horn because as of recording this, we're a little over 24 hours away from his Notre Dame Irish. And I'm not going to lie, Jackson, I'm tempted to place a very, very large wager on Penn State because I don't understand. Obviously, college is different than the NFL, that they can be very secretive about Abdul Carter's injury. And we can let's just assume as we record this today, he doesn't play. But Notre Dame's missing a star defensive lineman. And I just think the quarterback, all these bowl games, once you get away from that first round where they play at home, are in controlled neutral environment. The better passing quarterback in the better passing explosive attack is at Penn State. Like you could argue that these teams are the same. Okay, I'd give the slide to Penn State. I can't. I don't quite understand how they're favored. I mean, do you feel that your squad is better than my bald brother James Franklin and the Penn State Nittany Lions?
I do because I think it's not a lot of flashy names, right? When you go from Notre Dame's perspective, all those guys you mentioned, the D line will probably go third, fourth round, not real flashy linebackers. Xavier Watson, the safeties, the secondary they have, I think is one of the best, most underrated in the country. But to your point about Abdul Carter, I think it's a big deal if he doesn't play because you saw at some points that Boise State was able to stretch out on the outside and get some of those first downs. And I think with Riley Leonard, that's what he likes to do. And I was kind of shocked Riley Leonard was able to speed past some of those Georgia defenders. And I feel like Abdul Carter is one of those guys where, I don't know, you think he runs a 4.4, 4.5 when it comes to the combine that he could catch up to Riley. So I think it's a big deal. I do think they match up pretty well. The only thing I worry about Penn State's passing attack is if Al Golden figures out a way, and they've been prone to be bad against tight ends recently, even with Georgia too. Outside of some miscommunication, they could have had a touchdown late in that 4th and 2. I do worry about Tyler Warren. I don't know if he's going to go Xavier Watts just straight up one-on-one. Are they going to double bracket him? Because outside of that, they don't have a whole lot of receivers. So I know Drew Allar's got a big arm, talented quarterback, could go number one. But if you can lock down Warren, excluding that they, get Allen and Singleton involved in the passing game too, I don't know if the receivers for Penn State can hold up against, Notre Dame's secondary.
Yeah, I think, I probably got a lot of people listening that definitely that know these rosters well, but probably a lot that don't. I mean, Abdul Carter, and for those that might have turned in really for the first time to lock in on Penn State would have been that game against Boise, and he got hurt really early on. Though he did have that one pass rush where he kind of dropped the hoop. He's Micah Parsons. That's that type player. Versatility, pass rush, but you've seen him if you watched him during the season. If he's off the line of scrimmage and they run like a quick screen, he can run outside like laterally down the side. I mean, he's a freak.
Mm.
And I think if this was an NFL game, Al Golden obviously is a famous name because he's coached at Miami. And Necki, is that how you say the offensive
Yeah, I think
coordinator
it's
for
I
Penn
think it's
State?
Koldal Necky. Yeah, something like
Necki,
that.
yeah. I mean,
He came from Kansas first
yeah,
year.
he's definitely one of, I would say, in college football circles, one of the star coordinators, are viewed as, just a guy that feels inevitable to be a head coach in a Power Four program. I would say in the next, obviously not this cycle, but probably the next cycle, especially if Aller were to return, which I still think is. I was thinking about that today. I mean, they're probably a win away if he throws 2 or 3 touchdowns and beats Notre Dame. If you get to the national championship, I think he would solidify himself as a top 10, top 15 pick. So it would just be like, does he want to just play and hang out in college like Leinart again, or does he want to, take his talents? But the coordinator matchup of Golden and Necki is that's That's freaking awesome. I mean, if this, it'd be like Flores against Kyle Shanahan, right? Or Aaron Glenn against Kevin O'Connell. Like it's a bright lights college football name, like we've seen forever with the Sabans and the Kirbys when they take on big time offensive coordinators. But I'm really really excited to watch that. I mean, at the end of the day, this is an old school. I mean, these programs. Well, I mean, shit, you're so young, but even before my kind of got into sports in the mid '90s, I think in like the '80s, in the heyday of Lou Holtz and Joe Paterno, this was one of the biggest rivalries in college sports, in any basketball or football. But I think this is on the short list of like Florida State, Miami in their heydays playing each other. Now they were conference foes, but I would say Penn State and Notre Dame, I think is a pretty, for older people, kind of had like an NFL game feel in the 80s with Lou and Paterno and just I mean, the countless NFL players on both teams. I mean, these were two of the powerhouse programs, you know, way back in the day. They were really kind of like an Alabama or Georgia as football was really taking off in like the 70s and 80s, just nationally becoming, the equal of baseball. And now what it's become, it became a little tougher for them, but it's cool to see this. I mean, this is a big time bright lights brand matchup. I mean, but all four of these teams, they would have been if you pick 8 teams that you would want in the Final Four. These would have been. I mean, Ohio State, Notre Dame would have been top 2 or 3 picks, but I think Penn State wouldn't have been far behind Texas, who would have been a top 5 pick as well.
What do you think changed for you about your perspective on Penn State? Was it that game after Ohio State when they lost it, the Oregon Big Ten championship? Like, what kind of changed your perspective? Because you've been on saying that this Penn State team could win it all for about a month now, and they progressively look good. And people will go out there and say, "Oh, they've only played SMU, they played Boise State, but they've looked, like a national championship type of team. I guess this is their biggest, stage since, or their best team they played." But what's changed your perspective from, I guess, the beginning of the season to now about Penn State?
Well, I think one thing I've learned working in football and then doing this and seeing it from a little bit like more of like a 20,000 foot view is you cannot win big in the pros or, and I would say this is basically pros light in the Final Four, now the college football player, if you don't have a top end defense. So you look at all four of these teams, they all got NFL guys all over on defense. No different than the NFL. The Chiefs have been winning Super Bowls, defense. The Ravens, conference championship defense. The 49ers over the years, the Rams, like you got to have a good defense. Then it's like, okay, we all got sweet defenses. Well, who's your quarterback? And I think you usually just lean to the team with the better quarterback. And I think Drew Aller, watching that USC game, I actually didn't watch it live, so I had to go back and watch the highlights of kind of that historic comeback, right? I mean, that was honestly a loss for Lincoln Riley that derailed their season. And you watching these highlights, Warren had, I think his final numbers were like 17 of 200. It was crazy. It was like one of the
Ridiculous.
lines of the year. But Aller made some plays in that game that were like, man, this was really, really impressive. And then I think that the conference championship game against Oregon, and they took some early shots and they were down, but he made some big time plays in that game. And I just went, God, I just like this quarterback. They have good running backs. So does Notre Dame. So I would say those two cancel it out. Assuming Love, again, like Abdul Carter, we good on that knee injury? That's a little concerning, isn't it?
It is a little concerning. That was one of my other questions I had for you too. Was who was at a bigger disadvantage, Notre Dame without Jeremiah Love, or Penn State with that Abdul Carter? Because Jeremiah Love, although they've got Jadarian Price, he's kind of that downhill running back. He's not that explosive guy like Jeremiah Love. Jeremiah Love is kind of that one of a kind type of running back. And same with Abdul Carter. Like you can replace him with somebody, but he's not going to show you that same production as two of those guys. Jay Love is concerning too because it's not his same ankle, it's a knee. So now it's like, oh, great. Now we got to deal with a knee and an ankle on the same leg.
See, so that's, I would say, both teams very dependent on those two guys, but the defense can still function without Carter. It's not as dominant, but they still have a ton of other NFL guys. Your guy's offense is pretty predicated on handing that guy the ball. I mean, his play against Indiana kind of, opened the floodgates, and I mean, it's got to be the longest play so far from scrimmage in these playoffs. What was it? it was technically 98 yards, but he got the handoff like
Yeah.
3 yards deep. He
103,
ran off.
104. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and he was, and Indiana's defense is not their problem. Like they were good on defense. Turns out their quarterback, do you see, he played the whole season with like an ACL injury?
Kind
Pretty
of
crazy.
wild.
But I would say obviously enormous, somewhat cancel each other out. But given that how important he is to your offense and how running the ball is such a big deal, uh, it'd be pretty concerning, like losing him. Assuming you tell me they're both out, I believe you. That's the hard part about college with these injuries. You never, they could both easily play and look okay, and they could
Mhm.
both just be like pregame warmups and then not able to go, or do one of those, what was it, Tennessee's running backs? He like kind of started, then he didn't play. It's very secretive. So I just lean like the quarterback passing the ball, right? If they both come out, Drew Aller's a first round pick, and your guy just is not. And there's nothing wrong. I mean, he still might go
Mhm.
third, fourth round as like some project, compete to be a backup. But that's a pretty big difference if one guy's slinging the ball. Like Riley Leonard's just not, like, you guys win a lot of games with him throwing like Jimmy G lines, right? Like 80
Mhm.
yards, 110 yards. And Penn State, like when they're looking good, I mean, their guys slinging it a little bit. And I mean, you could argue the best player on their team, not named Abdul Carter, is the tight end, and he has gone to a different level as they've gotten out of the cold and into these controlled environments, and that's what this is going to be. So, listen, it's a fantastic. I mean, James Franklin's a polarizing guy, but there's no disputing he's an elite recruiter, and he was pre NIL, post NIL. He's great at it. And I would say motivate, like, and one thing I respect about him is teams have underachieved, but no one's ever called his teams like soft. They just haven't like won big games, but everyone goes, God, Penn State's a very physical team. And
Mhm.
he's an offensive guy, right? Former quarterback. Makes sense. Notre Dame, your guy is a former linebacker, that they're really tough and physical. So I think these teams are very, very similar. It's why I would probably take the underdog, whoever, uh, you know, was a 1 or 2 point underdog. But I've liked Penn State, and I'm gonna keep rolling in it. This game, whoever wins this game would be playing with a lot of house money. I mean, if I would have told Notre Dame fans or Penn State fans, even if you end up losing by 20 to Ohio State, that you were in the national championship game, and you won 3 playoff games. I mean, you talk about a successful, what an incredible year for those two guys, right? NFL playoffs. We're talking about the NFL playoffs. You bet we are. Get in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Scoring touchdowns is a key to winning in the NFL playoffs. And the key to you scoring big is betting on them at DraftKings, the number one place to bet touchdowns. Ready to place your first bet? Try betting on something as simple like a player to score a touchdown. Go to DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. Here's another reason to watch your favorite players crush it in the playoffs. New customers bet $5 to get 200 in bonus bets instantly. Score big during the NFL playoffs with the DraftKings Sportsbook. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Use the code JOHN, John. That's code JOHN for new customers to get 200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours.
That's what's so cool about the 12-team playoff. I mean, Penn State, there was some stat that they would make 8 or 9 out of the last 10 or 12 playoffs if it were to be a 12-team playoff. And then for Notre Dame, you lose to NIU most years, 99.9% of the years, you're not making the 14 playoff. But doesn't this game to you seem like it's going to be like that Georgia game where both teams just could try to control the line of scrimmage, battle the trenches, and it's only a matter of team, or I guess which team either, botches a punt, blocks a punt,
Yeah.
throws an interception, fumbles, or something like that. It just feels like it's going to be the same thing like we saw against Georgia. And that's one thing I do give Notre Dame a lot of credit is they have capitalized all season on turnovers. And, Drew Aller at sometimes is prone to throw an interception or two, or maybe even fumble like we saw against Boise State. That's one thing I kind of lean towards Notre Dame. But again, Riley Leonard's been shown that he can do the exact same.
I'll never forget, it would have been like 2012. It was the SEC championship game, and it was when Aaron Murray was the quarterback of Georgia playing. Like, this was the start of like peak Saban dynasty. And I remember like every single snap on both sides of the ball, guys were just getting crushed. And it was like, it felt like every player on defense for both teams were an NFL team. I think this game is going to be an absolute war zone. And it's also like whoever comes out, you just pray to God you don't lose a couple bodies because I think from the jump, this is going to be one of the hardest hitting games of the year. And Georgia and Notre Dame was like that, right? And this is even going to be amped up because of what's on the line. And listen, like if James Franklin, your guy would get more credit, right? Because both of them don't get that much credit for beating Indiana or SMU or Boise. But the Georgia win is an incredible victory, right? You beat Georgia, even if this is not his greatest team. Like that was a big time victory. So if he goes back to back Georgia and Penn State, like that's that'd be pretty sweet. And for James, I mean, this would I don't know, the biggest win of his career. And I think the players all know this, what's on the line, the program's history. I'd be stunned if these two coaches didn't kind of tap into some of those 80s highlights of like Jerome Bettis and, some of the dudes from Penn State back in the day. I think this thing is, I'm more fired up for this game than the other game.
Mm. Yeah, because this one could go back and forth, whereas the other one, more people are leaning towards Ohio State. I was going to ask you this before we, head to Ohio State, Texas. James Franklin, Marcus Freeman had a joint press conference this morning while we're recording this on Wednesday. And James Franklin said it straight up in front of Marcus Freeman that Notre Dame should join a conference. What's your take on that right now in a new landscape of college football? Because I know you and Colin talked about how Notre Dame's got a big advantage moving forward, with the NIL, the academic side of things. Marcus Freeman's a great recruiter. On top of that, from Notre Dame side, it's like, we got our own TV network. We don't really have to join a conference. They beat Georgia. They move on to the semis. Usually that $14 million when you advance gets kind of distributed to a whole conference where Notre
I saw
Dame
that.
got all $14 million, which is pretty sweet. So I don't know if that goes straight to the NIL fund or what, but what do you make of like Notre Dame, if they should join a conference or not? Do you think they'll be forced to eventually?
I think it's easy for James Franklin to say, but I saw that same graphic. It's like the SEC, $28 million. Well, that's all the teams. And then it was like Notre Dame, $14 million. And if they were to win this game, I don't know what the next number is, but it's higher. They
I
keep
think
it
it's
all.
20. Yeah,
They're
18 or
so
20.
total, right? And they just get an extra $6 million. So they keep all the money to themselves. Like they are not in some partnership with 12, 14, 18 other partners. They have a one-sided television deal that is financially incredible, that works, right? They rate. So it's like my only issue with them is they did that like alliance or deal with the ACC a couple years ago, right? Where they for a couple year stretch they were playing a bunch of those teams, and it felt like they were like pseudo in the ACC, like they were kind of wetting their beak. Uh, they've always felt more like a Big Ten team, but listen, if I was their AD, their chancellor, anyone involved in their financials, like why would we join a conference? We don't need to. And we already have automatic games against some good teams. Now, like, is it worth it for them? Because people are like, why don't you play Penn State, Michigan? You already play USC, do rotations with like Florida State, Miami, Ohio State. Well, it's like, well, then we'll miss the playoffs. Why would we even do that? Why don't we just keep playing a couple tough teams and then a bunch of randos and go 10 and 2, 11 and 1? One thing I think this year is going to buy them that even next year, I haven't looked at their schedule, but if they have schedules that parallel this year that aren't like, I mean, not great, I think they'll get the benefit of the doubt. And this year it's like they had to be 11 and 1. Well, part of that is they lost to NIU. I think they have upcoming seasons where they could go 10 and 2, and I think they would have no problem giving them somewhere 10 to 12, 10, 11, or 12 that seeding. So I actually think Notre Dame's helped themselves out a lot in getting the benefit of the doubt moving forward with the coach. Because you'd be like, oh, Marcus Freeman, he's recruiting a bunch of NFL guys. Their team's good. They can beat anybody. Especially if this
Yeah,
game's close, even if they lose. I think I wouldn't join a conference. And I think James Franklin probably wants him to join theirs. It just helps the Big Ten's brand, right? It's easier to recruit. Notre Dame and Penn State are probably recruiting a lot of the same players, right?
Yeah, a lot of Midwest guys, maybe in the South, but not really. They're mostly Midwest. I'm looking at their schedule right now in 2025. They've got A&M on their schedule. They got at Arkansas, Boise State, which is kind of a fun matchup, USC. But yeah, other than that, you've got some basics: Syracuse, NC State, Boston College, Pitt, and Navy. So it's
See,
not the greatest
but
schedule.
that's a real schedule. I mean, you say Boston College, Pitt, and Navy, like those are legitimate teams. Like that is I give them credit for not just having nonstop MAC teams,
Mm.
and not that they don't play a MAC team here and there, but like playing Boise, even if it's in Notre Dame, like that's a real game, right? Playing, I guess they get A&M. That was a home and home. They get them at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
That'll be a big game. Like that's a real game. Playing USC every year is no joke, right? I mean, that's a real rivalry. They've just happened to suck lately, but and hell, I mean, you guys even this year, like they were shitty, but it was still a tough game. Took two pick sixes, right?
Yeah, that was a barn burner for sure. That USC
If they would have
game, they
lost that
played
game, they
Louisville.
wouldn't have got in the playoffs.
They
Huh?
would have been out. Yeah, they would have been out, especially USC finishing up 6-4, 6-5. Transitioning to this next game, 5 Texas, 8 Ohio State. Before we get to Ohio State, because everybody and their mother is going for Ohio State and deservingly so, the hottest team in the country. How can Texas win this game? Is there any shot? How, in your mind, do you see Texas pulling this one out?
I mean, I don't see it's just a bad matchup because their deficiency has been coverage, and that's how, kind of once Scadaboo hit, you get them on one-on-one coverage. Cade Klubnik was hitting guys down the sideline. Well, what's Ohio State's best advantage? It's throwing the ball outside the hash or outside the numbers. So I don't know. You just have to ugly the game, and you just got to hope that Ohio State wants to run the ball like Michigan. But I think that they kind of learned from that game, and they have not looked to run the ball these last couple of games. So, especially in a controlled environment, why wouldn't you throw it to Jeremiah Smith like once every 3 plays? I think you just feed that guy. To me, the only way you win is like a low scoring, ugly game. You just like that game that just happened to Texas where got discombobulated, that they would lose that game by 25 points against Ohio State if they get off kilter. Now, the crazy part is Texas came out that game against ASU, and you're like, are they going to win this game 50 to nothing? 2 plays, touchdown, and then that punt return where the speed, like they have dudes. So it's like, can their offense? I guess you'd also have to say, is Ohio State's offense just going to do this for 4 straight games? Just basically feel like they're going to score in every drive, or are they just going to have a weird half? Because they used to have those in the regular season. You'd watch them against Nebraska, you're like, what is going on?
Mm.
But they have not looked like Michigan, same thing. But they've been like the Kansas City Chiefs, like the Tyreek Hill version the last couple games. So I think you got to hope they're a little off. Texas defense is good, but man, that secondary and specifically the corners. Well, it's like they got a guy that everyone's saying that's 19 years old that would be the #1 pick in the draft, who looks like he weighs like 250 pounds and runs a 4.4. How and their quarterback's playing with a lot of confidence. It does feel like the Ravens Steeler games. Like how could anyone pick the Steelers? Now Texas, if you're using that example, is better than the Steelers, but it does feel a little bit like Ohio State is like I wouldn't bet that game just because it almost feels like too easy. But I'd be hard pressed. Like I think it would be no coach has more of the four has more pressure than Ryan because everyone thinks he should win. I mean, they're the heavy betting favorite on DraftKings, so basically like 1-1. And for example, Penn State's like 6-1. Notre Dame's like almost 5-1. Uh, it, it would be this would almost I don't want to say diminish the last 2 weeks, but Ryan Day's now put himself in this situation a lot like going into the Michigan game. Nobody thought he was going to lose. Sometimes when you lose that game, it's almost worse because like, oh, they're so good, it's not even fair. That's what everyone thinks. How could you not when you're watching them? I don't know what I mean. What do you think? I just think that I think you'd have to win the game like 19-15. It'd have to. I can't see Texas winning like 35-32.
No, and they would have to hold Ohio State to a slow start in the first quarter. Both of their games in the playoff, 205 passing yards against Tennessee, 212 passing yards, 233 yards against Oregon. So that, to your point about Will Howard, you get him going early, his confidence only spikes. You get Emeka Buka and all. There's just too many weapons. And you flip the side with Texas, and heading into the season, it was, oh, this Texas offense got so many weapons. Now you kind of look at them, it's like we got 2 backup running backs that are inconsistent. The offensive line struggled against Georgia twice, who's a really good front seven. And, oh, yeah, Ohio State's front seven is getting better. And finally, something that we've been wanting to see the entire season with JT and Jack Sawyer. Okay. Okay, what kind of weapons do we have on the outside? That Isaiah Bond, the receiver you got from Bama, has been non-existent, and Golden's been great. But how can you compete against Ohio State with that elite of a defense with one wide receiver and a tight? I think you're right. I think it's a bad matchup for Texas, and it's one of those little things that they've been having during the season where they either come off to a hot start and then that second, third quarter, it's like they can't run the ball, they can't do anything offensively, and then they get it into gear towards the end. I feel like Ohio State, you can't even do that. You got to compete drive for drive against them in order to have a shot.
Yeah, I think, the game I was at watching Texas live, now granted it was Quinn Ewers' first game back from injury. It was like a tight 7-3 game with like almost 2 minutes left in the first half, and then Oklahoma fumbled a little bit. But you're watching Texas, you're going, how do they have all this talent? They can't move the ball. And Texas gets in these ruts where the one thing that can't be denied is when Ohio State just gets it to their guys and just throws it a lot, it works. Texas tries that, and sometimes it does not work, right? And obviously Jeremiah Smith is better than anyone Texas has, but yeah, I think running the ball. One thing Chip just, when Chip really hit the scene at Oregon, he was a run play calling offensive coordinator. Like he called, now they just hit like 50, 60, 80-yard runs all the time at Oregon. So it felt like they were, when you say a really explosive offense, you think like Randy Moss, Tyreek Hill, you think wide receivers, but his offense is historically like what he wants to do. Shady McCoy had a great year for him. Like he wants to run his big signing when Philly, when he traded Shady, was assigned what's his name? The Cowboy running back, DeMarco, what the fuck's his name?
Oh,
DeMarco
DeMarco
Murray.
Murray. Yeah.
Like he loves running backs, and that's the thing about Michigan. I think he like I want to run the ball down your throat, and it just was an all-time backfire. And I just think that they've just embraced we can't even fake it, and there's no reason to. Well, I think if you're Sark, one thing that Kyle Shanahan has done this one year where they had to go on the road with Jimmy Garoppolo is like you got to when your offense isn't as good as the offensive teams you're playing, slow and ugly the game up. So Texas can't run the ball. Like that's the only way you can win. Run the ball, slow the game down. Run the ball. And I think it's hard for Sark because he likes to pass the ball, you know,
Yeah.
and it doesn't, and it might not work. And I think sometimes, the great NFL coaches will stick with the run because eventually I'll get a couple first downs, even if I got to punt a couple times. If we can just play a little defense early on, where most coaches that are inclined to pass it more than run it will just say, "Screw it, this isn't working." It's been a Kyle Shanahan subtract this year, but like why he's had so much success in the playoffs is like he's very stubborn in a good way, and he can slow the game down because you're not. Some teams are built for shootouts, in Texas against this. I mean, it feels like one of the best. And Ohio State has been built like this, right? Offensively, they have been really, really good under Ryan Day, passing the ball, and they got the best wide receiver they've had, and they've had great wide receivers. It's crazy. I mean, they had Marvin Harrison, who was the fourth pick in the draft, and this guy is way better, way better. And Marvin Harrison was like a no doubt about it, excellent All American player, and this guy's way better, and he's 19.
Now you know why Ryan Day was smiling ear to ear in that press conference when they told him. They said, "Hey, yeah, Jeremiah Smith, yeah, he signed to Ohio State," and he's just like, "Thank God." But to your point earlier about Chip Kelly, it is interesting how before the season we talked, or everyone was thinking about Ohio State's offense was going to be so predicated on the run. Now, part of that too, the offensive line had some injuries, and now they've kind of flipped in the playoff. Them changing their identity, say, "Hey, we're gonna pass to open the run. We're gonna give it out to Jeremiah Smith." Give it out to our weapons. It seems like that's what they've been preaching, or people have been preaching them to do all season. Penn State, we're going to lean more on the running game and then play action with Drew Aller and Tyler Warren. Notre Dame, we're not going to throw it as much. Denbrock earlier in the season kind of wanted to get Riley Leonard to be a passer. And then he said, you know what? We're going to run it with him. We're going to run it with our two running backs. And that's how we're going to win games. It seems like Texas's offense, to your point about Sark wanting to throw the ball more, it seems like we're here in the playoff and you still don't know what their identity is. I'm trying to look back on the season when Texas's offense was the best. Michigan, week 2. I can't think of a game where there's been like a dominant against a good opponent that Texas's offense has found an identity and they've looked the part of their talent that they have on the field.
They were better last year, right? I mean, they
Yeah.
felt much. Now, granted,
That game against Washington, you're right. Yeah.
I mean, Xavier Worthy. They had Xavier Worthy, who was a first round pick for the Chiefs, and Mitchell, who went in the second round. But I mean, a lot of people thought he was a top 15, 20 talent. I think there were some question marks off the field. But I will say this, and I have been critical of Sark over the years. But and Colin asked me that, like, who had does Sark have a lot of pressure? I think if on the pie chart of pressure, it's all on Ryan Day. Back to back years in the semifinals. This was a team like starting in 2014, so like a decade ago. 6-7, 5-7, 5-7, 7-6. They had one good year under Herman, 10 wins, but then 8 wins, 7 wins, 5 wins. And then Sark got there in the last couple years, 12-13. He's in the semifinals. And he was favored last year against Washington. I thought that line was off. I mean, it turns out Washington, right? They had the better quarterback. They had, I mean, an absolutely loaded offense and a coach that was literally going to Alabama. So now, granted, you could argue Sark declined Alabama, but it's like at worst they're equals, right? The coach, like DeBoer, was a star as well, so it's not like he was this like little engine that no one heard about. I think Sark's done a masterful job, and he's got resources like Ohio, like he's got a big budget, which helps in the NIL era. But he could lose this game by 15, 20 points, and it's like what he has done to the program to be in the SEC championship year one, to be in the semifinals. Now that ASU game, he had to win that. That would have been bad, right? So that would
It
have
would have
been
been really
bad.
bad.
But hey, listen, he did you see? Kenny Dillingham after the game talked about the defensive coverage, and people thought he was taking a shot at the DB, and he basically said that we teach him on that outbreaking route, which is 4th and 13. You're going to break, like they're going to run the out route at the sticks to try to get the first down. Pretty ballsy play call to essentially run a double move, because if you don't get protection, and they were bringing the house, that play does not work. That ain't like a three-step get rid of the ball. So if one of your offensive linemen, even if he trips or something, or someone screws up, that is a disaster if yours doesn't. So I give Sark credit. That was a ballsy call in that moment, because if something goes wrong, he gets sacked, or he scrambles and has to just throw it up. It looked easy, but it was not like I give Sark credit for that play call.
Did your perspective change a little bit on that with Ewers? I know obviously it's one throw, but on 4th and 13, I almost texted you. I was like, there's no way Ewers has the capability of doing that. Does any of that carry over to this game? Do you think there's any pressure, I guess more pressure on Ewers versus Sark alone, where Ewers doesn't win this game, he plays flat? Like, does he consider the transfer portal? Does he go to the NFL draft, or does that kind of not even matter in this
You know,
game?
it's weird when you looked at his numbers after the ASU game, they were really good. He was like 20 or 30, threw a bunch of touchdowns. And on individual plays, like that first touchdown throw, like a minute into the game, you're like, damn, that pass to essentially, I guess, was that the game? That was a game tying touchdown, right? Yeah, it was the
Yeah,
first
the fourth
overtime.
and 13, and then the second OT one, the one he had a helm was pretty
Yeah, he,
sweet when
he
he
made
stepped
some
up in the
great
pocket.
individual throws, but I still feel like, do I trust this guy against, again, he was against Arizona State, where besides Scattaboo, how many guys on that team start for Texas? Less than two or three, right?
Yeah.
Dillingham would take most of their players immediately and start them on their team, and they were going toe to. So it just the talent discrepancy there is pretty wide. Uh, I give you credit when you don't mentally crack, and there were points in time in that game where he could have just flattened. And you're right. I mean, the 4th and 13, there's no disputing like his arm talent. No one acts like he's like got some crappy arm, like a little pea shooter. Like he can, if he gets some time, he can sling it. It's just he also does some things, like just throwing the ball up to the guy that was double covered that was a pick that I would say was a huge moment in that game that helped get ASU back some momentum. And not the end of the world. It's not like a terrible decision, but he just makes plays like that, which I don't think he can afford to make if they, to beat Ohio State, or even if they get to the national championships against one of these other deep, like he'd have to be much more in control of where his ball's going. But he makes explosive plays, right? If he has some time.
On the defensive side of things for Ohio State, a guy that, they always mention, Jeremiah Smith would be number one in this year's draft, Caleb Downs would be up there for number two. I feel like a lot of people, and part of that has to do with the TV version. You don't really get to see a lot of Caleb Downs unless it's the Sky Cam and Herbstreit and Fowler go back and you see Caleb Downs like in the middle of the field. But from your perspective, being around the NFL and college, what sticks out to you about Caleb Downs, especially in this defense? Because it seems like he's one of those guys where, all right, Caleb, we'll put you in the middle of the field, sense whatever you want to sense, and his instincts and his change of direction is just something special. And he's definitely been. You want to talk about Jeremiah Smith coming from recruiting as a freshman, and then him be able to transfer from Alabama to Ohio State. Those two alone, if you would have gotten, if Ohio State would have gotten those two, and Judkins is okay, like they got him in the NIL money, and he's a good number two. But it's like those two players alone, you don't even have to get any other transfers. They'd still be in the situation they're at right now.
Yeah, I just think certain defensive backs pop immediately. And Derwin James was one of those guys. Minka Fitzpatrick was one of those guys. I would imagine if you go way back in the day, the Ed Reeds, even farther back, like the Rod Woodsons, if you just watch college football, you're like, is this guy the best player on the field? And, his versatility, I mean, to come into Alabama, and I know it's probably a little bit easier with the transfer portal. The competition might not be as crazy as it would have been 10 years ago, but to just immediately start and for Saban to just talk about this guy like he's a genius. And I didn't know that much about him just because I mean Bama makes a living off getting like number one 5-star players, right? Did I remember when Saban left and it was like Caleb Downs in the transfer portal? I remember it being a really big deal in college football. And I was like, maybe I need to pay a little more attention to this guy. It's like we cannot afford to lose him. Kind of like, and it shows you the power of quarterbacks. Remember when Lincoln left to USC, Oklahoma freaked out uh about Caleb. And like their AD put out a statement like, we'll do everything we can to keep Caleb. That's how I felt like Alabama was treating Caleb Downs. And it turned out like he was probably as good as gone, but like he was probably only he would have left Alabama for like two spots, probably like Georgia, Ohio State. It's not like he had a long list. Maybe
Mm.
Texas. I mean, it's or stay at Alabama. But yeah, I mean, he feels like a transcendent talent, and we get you know you watch Charger game, you watch Derwin James. When you get a versatile player at that position because they cover, whether it's a slot guy, tight ends, they can play the run. Caleb can return. He's just, yeah, they just change your defense.
It's gonna be a fun matchup. All four of these teams, blue bloods. I guess Texas has kind of the home field advantage here, being in the Cotton Bowl at AT&T Stadium. Thank God it's in a dome. Ohio State travels well, anyways. I always love is this gonna be a factor in this game or the noise or whatever with Ohio State? It's like, guys, Ohio State's played 15 games, 16 games this season coming off the Rose Bowl. It's like, give me a break. Or I was going to ask you this too. I see all the time on sports TV. Well, are these the best four teams in the college football playoff? Are these the best four teams we could have? It's like, yes, these are the four teams. I know it's not Oregon that we expected or Georgia that we expected, but I do legit. I would your thoughts on those four teams. I think they're the best four teams. I don't know what else you could put in there.
Yeah, I mean, what ASU that game was awesome, but I think when you look at it, there were six teams that were clearly head and shoulders above everyone else. And turns out Oregon, I mean, just had a bad day, perfect storm. Ohio State, who's the favorite to win it all, like I think if they played 10 times, Oregon looks like that once or twice. I mean, that was somewhat of an outlier performance. Snowballed on them and it just got away from them quick. But and Georgia. I mean, I think those six teams were we could have just had a 16 playoff this year. Now, I'm glad Arizona State, like that was a really cool moment for college football, but I wouldn't put them, over the course of a season in that group. And then we saw a couple matchups, and Ohio State killed Oregon, and Georgia lost fair and square. So yeah, these were a lot of people picked. I would say most people picked Ohio State, right, to win the national championship at the beginning of the year. I would say most people had Texas circled as a Final Four team. And I would say Penn State and Notre Dame at minimum were picked to be like top 8 teams, right? Get the Final Four, you have to, you never know who your matchup's going to be. But yeah, I think preseason, we all acknowledged the rosters, the talent. That's the thing in college football more than the NFL. Like your roster and your talent of future NFL guys and draftable players really matters. That's what was so incredible about ASU being able to come back against Texas. You're like, how are they doing? Obviously, Scattaboo, but it's like, how are they pulling this off?
It's pretty incredible to see his draft stock rise. I saw another ranking the other day, which the rankings doesn't mean a whole lot, but him being a top 5 running back at the beginning of the season, I think he was like bottom 20. It's pretty remarkable, his thing. But I was going to wrap up with two more questions for you. SEC having a down year, is that just because the landscape of college football and it's just year to year where they kind of got left out with Ole Miss, South Carolina, Alabama losing 3 games, the Big Ten, the top 3 teams we knew were going to make their way in. Not really a big deal, right? It's just a 1 year thing. We all know the SEC depth wise is the best conference.
Yeah, I think there's two separate conversations. On a weekly basis, just playing teams with a bunch of NFL players over the last 10, 20 years. It's not debatable. One thing Colin got me thinking about that the top of the Big Ten and the top of the SEC has been relatively similar, right? Harbaugh had a powerhouse these last 3 or 4 years, beat Saban last year. Ohio State has been basically an SEC team since Urban Meyer got there through Ryan Day. They went toe to toe with one of those great Georgia teams a couple years ago. Remember on was it New Year's night? Uh, but the Big Ten programs have more money, and I would include Notre Dame in that as well. So you got these Michigan. Well, Bryce Underwood was supposed to go to LSU. Well, why did he go to Michigan? They got more cash. Ohio State has unlimited money. Notre Dame has just, I mean, every bit of Ohio State, Oregon type money. Oregon is now in the Big Ten. So when you look at the financial backing of the elite programs in the Big Ten, and we haven't even mentioned USC, who just can't figure, how to chew gum and walk straight at the same time right now. But they definitely have financial backing if things start. If they were winning like Oregon, Ohio State, the money there would be every bit the equal of like they'd be signing Bryce Underwoods to 12, $15 million. So you look at Alabama, their AD put out a statement begging for money. LSU just, I mean, loses out a guy to Michigan, and even Brian Kelly said like, yeah, it's just tough. Georgia last year, and I don't blame them, but they're like, yeah, we're just not going to pay a recruit $4 million, and he ends up going to Nebraska, Big Ten. So the Big Ten schools, like, this is all about money now. Like Mario Cristobal is not a very good coach, I think, relative to like how much recruiting and talent and he can dominate that element of it. But he does have financial backing. That's a huge, huge player in moving forward. Now, maybe that changes with like revenue sharing and everyone's under the same salary cap. If I'm the SEC, I want that to come, right? So it's like, hey, quarterbacks make this starting, and it becomes a little more equal playing field. But right now, it's not. And I saw, I don't know if you saw the story, but Dirk Cutter retired, the Boise OC. And he said he must have done a local interview. And he said that one of their top guys on defense got a DM within 24 hours of them losing the game from Oregon that offered him 700 or $750,000. And he said
Wow.
our total budget at Boise is $2 million, and that's up $400,000 from the previous year. So it's like, how can we compete? Now, as of right now, that guy has not left Boise for Oregon. But I think Cutter was just trying to say like how shady this whole thing is and how unfair it is to put these kids in these situations. Like this guy doesn't want to leave his teammates. He loves playing at Boise, but it's the Wild Wild West. But that's the thing with Oregon. Like they can just offer people like $700,000, and he's just like a corner or a linebacker. This is not, you know, uh, Caleb Downs or Caleb Williams, or it's not like some lock top 10 pick or Micah Parsons or whoever. This is just like a guy that will start for us. We'll give you 700. That why? Because their budget is like 20, $25 million. That's a huge advantage for the Big Ten. Is the money and
That's what's
the booster
crazy.
money. Like I mean the now how long can this sustain? I don't know because if I was a rich guy and I was cutting these checks, my team better be like in the playoffs every year. Because if we ever have like an 8-win season, Ole Miss is a good example of that. They spent a lot of money last offseason. They didn't make the playoffs. Well, it's like all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I gave you $1 million last year. I'll give you $100,000 this year. Make my money go a little farther.
That's what's so crazy about the whole tampering aspect. And I don't I don't mind it. I'm not heartburned over it, but it's crazy how it's just legal where Oregon can just DM a defensive line from
It
Boise
technically
State.
isn't, right? It's just not being enforced. I don't think it's technically
Or
legal.
no, I don't think it is. I mean, if I was Boise State, why would you not, I guess, report Oregon or report whoever that they were DMing them? But I don't know what the whole rules with the whole window, but he's not
They don't
in the
want to get
portal.
they don't want to get sued. So it's like, Harbaugh gets in trouble for giving the guy a cheeseburger in 2020. It's like, well, these are just NCAA rules, very black and white. If I'm the NCAA and I hammer Oregon, let's say I'm just making up a infraction, like I deduct 10 scholarships for 2025. Well, the labor and the play, all these lawsuits have been all leaning toward the players. Like that would be like anti-competitive, and that's where I think they're just terrified. They don't want to get sued. They don't want to lose any money, so they just let it go. And that's where I think none of these coaches are against anyone getting paid. They just think like this is not really how it works. Now you could also push back like if Dirk Cutter wasn't 65 and he was 45 and Texas or some Ohio State wanted him to be the offensive coordinator, wouldn't it operate the same thing? Like when your season ended, I would hit you up, be like, "Hey, you're making 500 grand. We'll offer you 1.5 million dollars to be our offensive coordinator." So you could argue it's the same thing.
Yeah, I saw Washington State lost 36 players to the transfer portal. And it's funny, too. The FCS championship was on Monday, and they showed before how Chris Kleiman, who was the former NDSU coach there forever and won a bunch of national championships with them, he was repping Kansas State, and he was at midfield. And I kind of made jokes with my buddy. I was like, yeah, Chris Kleiman's there supporting NDSU, but he's low key recruiting, too. He's low key recruiting some guys at the FCS level.
He was at that game on Monday night.
Yeah, he was at that game. He was talking to the head coach at NDSU. I don't know his name, but it seems like they have a new head coach every year who win a national championship, then go on to USC or go on to wherever. But I just thought it was kind of funny how Kleiman's there repping Kansas State, where it's like, yeah, he's there repping, watching North Dakota State, something that he's built. But it's like at the same time, how can you not look over at NDSU's wide receiver number 5, who's Trey Lance's brother? That dude could start at a Power 5 conference easily. He's a junior. I don't know if he's going to leave or stay. Who knows? Maybe he's like a Christian Watson and just kind of makes his way up throughout the draft, gets drafted 3rd or 4th round. But I feel like you're starting to see that even more with NIL in the portal, is a lot of these guys going to the FCS in the group of 5.
See, that would be the defense of Oregon coming after that dude on Boise. It's like Kleiman's at Kansas State, right? Which is a good football job. The guy that replaced him, I think his name's like I don't want to screw up his last name, but he's now the Fresno State head coach. Uh, South Dakota State's head coach just left to become Washington State's head coach. So all these guys go to Kansas State, Fresno State, Washington State with hopes of one day being the head coach of like Texas or Alabama or Oregon. Like that's if things go really well and those guys rattle off like back-to-back 10 or 11 win seasons, they will be up for the head coach of Washington if Jed Fishley. It's no different than a player. So it's like I I don't know. Dirk Cutter, like, bro, you bounced around, you became head coach. It's like, what the hell's the difference? And I understand there should be some rules, but if I was at Oregon as like the quote unquote GM or the head coach, I'd be doing the same thing. We'd have a list of it wouldn't be everybody, but like give me the top like 10 guys at the Boise's, the UCFs. I guess UCF's a power forward, but still, whoever. I mean, guys that could immediately start for us that we can give Washington State, Oregon State, it'd probably be one guy a program. And we either have a connection through a player on our team that knows them, or we just go directly to him or to his agent. And they're going to get some yeses, right?
Yeah, how can you knock on those guys for just moving up the ladder? Like you mentioned, I've done all I could here at my school winning national championships. I want to go into Pac-12. I want to go to the Mountain West and try to compete and then eventually make myself up the ladder. Like you
One thing
mentioned.
I heard, I follow this guy that used to be a GM in college football, and I saw a clip on social media, and he said the first couple years of the transfer portal, because NIL was so new and so many programs didn't have their collective or money flow figured out, that the transfer portal was loaded with a lot of like elite guys, like ton of Jordan Addison, Caleb Downs type guys the first couple years. And that clearly has played out that way, right? In the draft, a lot of guys have been on multiple teams. Well, now a lot of these programs have corralled some money. So their top guys, they can be very, very aggressive to keep that they want. So a lot of guys going in the transfer portal, it's become a little like NFL free agency. Like once the franchise tag happened, it's like actually NFL free agency, a lot of the top guys don't actually hit it. They either get tagged or extended. And I do wonder if the transfer portal has been diminished a little bit, at least with the power four guys jumping in. Like if you're a power four guy and jump in, you're probably not an elite guy. Because if I want to keep you, if I'm a top 30 program, I'm just giving you 500, a million, whatever it costs to keep you. Where I think where you can pillage is the Boise, Fresno State, like those type programs are still right for the picking. But I do wonder if it's harder. Like, why does this guy want to leave Alabama? Like, what's his actually? Because if they wanted to keep him, they probably could, right? Or it's like Ohio State. Because if I would have told you 5 years ago, like, hey, three guys want to transfer from Ohio State, well, a lot of programs would be all over him. Now I'd be like, that's why wouldn't Ryan Day just want to keep him? They have an unlimited budget, or Oregon or wherever. So I do wonder if now it's much more like the minor league non-power four, that FCS game. I mean, how many programs had their GM? Hell, they might have sent them there on a scouting mission.
Yeah, there was a lot of good players on both sides. Even NDSU. I know that it's FCS, it's a lower division, but when you talk about dynasties in sports, NDSU's got to be. I mean, 10 national titles in 14 years. That's pretty incredible what they're going on in North Dakota State. You can even watch the entire season, and you probably blink your eyes. You could guess who would be in it. It'd be either North Dakota State, South Dakota State, or insert blank team.
Yeah,
It's pretty crazy.
Montana State.
Yeah, I was pretty happy to see Montana State lose. So
Is
that was
isn't their
awesome.
quarterback supposed to be? But think about that. Like the Washington State guy, South Dakota State, the the Fresno State guy is only 1 year removed from North Dakota State.
Mm.
Those programs, like, would it shock you if South Dakota State, like a lot like Signetti, brought over like 15 guys to Washington State?
Yeah, South Dakota State's quarterback actually just committed to Iowa the other day, which is kind of a good fit. But to your
Yeah,
point,
see
that's
that
guys
guy's
moving up
better
the
than
ladder.
Washington State, but I'm saying that next tier guys, like how many guys can that guy bring with him to Washington State? And that's just the kind of the new college football, at least for the foreseeable future, which in a weird way is kind of entertaining.
I like it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
free agency. It kind of brings more eyes to the sport. We always talk about parity and drama and stuff, but man, this season's flown by. It kind of stinks that we only got three more games left, but I'm excited to see how it ends up turning out for sure.
Yeah, so you feeling good? We'll get your feelings on your way out because I'm taking Penn State.
Yeah, I feel good. I got Notre Dame. I think they win. I'm going to go 24-20. I think it's a low scoring game like you mentioned, a dogfight back and forth. Hopefully my voice, I'm going to try to keep my voice together for when we do the reaction after cuz screaming a lot during that, but I know we talk about it at Notre Dame all the time and stuff, but what Marcus Freeman's done, I mean that turnaround with NIU losing that football game to where they are right now, and just the future of what it brings, and Brian Kelly quitting on Notre Dame and them wanting to stay in house and trusting the players. The athletic director said, "Hey, we're going to look elsewhere." The players wanted Marcus Freeman. He comes in, and it's been a bumpy road. Marshall, NIU, obviously are the worst two losses, but this run's been special. It's been fun to see for sure. And there's been so much young recruiting that they have for years to come. I mean, their secondaries, freshmen, sophomores. It's incredible. And then you're like you mentioned, your guy Bryce Young too. So
What year? What year's Love?
sophomore.
Yeah, so it's like the core of their team. That video where the strength coach announces to the team, a couple days after Brian Kelly, maybe it was within the week. It was relatively quick that they made the decision. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty cool. And yeah, man, I just you guys played. I remember first week of the season. Was it 2 years ago? You played Ohio State and lost kind of like a barn burner game.
Oh,
Or
when
was that
was
3 years ago?
that? No, that was last year. It wasn't the first week, but it was in the middle of the it was in the middle of the season. I want to say October when they wore the green uniforms and they brought 12 guys on defense and Ohio State scored on the one and Kyle McCord was dealing. I think he had a third and 23.
I thought you
And
guys had a game like week 1 or 2 where you won like 20-15 or 20-12. Might have been 2020. I thought it was 2022, but again, it's so Kyle McCord's long gone, who actually kind of looks sweet now and might be a good like third round draft pick. But
dark horse in the NFL
yeah,
draft.
well,
Who knows?
okay, good luck to you, Jackson. I will talk to you soon, man.
Appreciate you. Have a good one.